most of us were once foreigners.
And let's be honest, Bergoglio does not like the US at all.
Caloroso saluto al nobile popolo cinese.
The church has paid at least $2 billion to victims of abuse, and hundreds of priests have been removed.
American Catholics are so different from Italian ones. Buongiorno a tutti ragazzi, Luca here from St. Patrick, the official church of American Catholics here in Rome. And when I was in the US, I met many Catholics, but I soon realized that they were very, very different from the ones I know, the Italians. And then I also noticed something very peculiar, a certain distrust toward the Pope that at the time had just been elected, Jorge Bergoglio, Pope Francis. Then last month, I published a video about the relationship between Italians and Pope Francis, and in the comments, many Americans were like, Luca, here in the US, we don't like him either. So I decided to explore the reasons behind this controversy. But before that, before starting this journey, please, if you like my work and my research, subscribe to the channel and activate the notification button. Now let's dive in.
Unlike what happens with the Italians, a peculiar characteristic of the relationship between Pope Francis and the United States is that, generally speaking, the dislike is mutual. The two parts just don't get along well, and this has to do both with some aspects of Bergoglio's life and ideas, but also with some particular characteristics of American Catholicism. But let's start with Pope Francis.
Finally, the pontiff, who's never been to the United States in all of his 78 years, emerged.
Let's be honest, Pope Francis has never loved the United States and probably never will. He visited the country just one time, 10 years ago in 2015, and never came back. There are several reasons behind this choice. First of all, Bergoglio is Argentine, and for these people, the United States has always represented the empire that marked them closely and that has always influenced, for better or worse, the life of all the countries of Latin America, the masters, in a few words. In recent years, though, the relationship between South America and the United States has been changing a lot, and we'll get to that at the end of the video. But for Argentines of Bergoglio's generation, the American empire remains an imperialistic power for which these people perceive a lot of distrust. And speaking of the American empire, there is the problem of the values that this empire conveys and that Pope Francis has always detested. Many times during his pontificate, even without directly criticizing the United States, Bergoglio has lashed out against the extreme and purely individualistic capitalism of which, in his opinion, the US is the greatest global expression. And it is no coincidence that during his first presidency, Donald Trump, considered the greatest expression of this worldview, had a terrible relationship with Pope Francis.
Una che pensa soltanto in fare muri, sia dove sia, e non fare ponti, non è cristiano.
And the character of Donald Trump perfectly embodies another point of rupture in the relationship between Bergoglio and the United States, the issue of migrants, which has been since the very beginning at the center of Bergoglio's agenda, as I explained in this other video that I link in the description down below.
We, the people of this continent, are not fearful of foreigners, because most of us were once foreigners.
In the Pope's idea, opposite to that of many Americans, it should not be the migrant who commits himself to seeking fortune in a certain country, but it should be that country to provide him some kind of fortune by treating him with dignity and respect. The Pope is absolutely convinced of this subtle but fundamental difference that was reiterated by him in a letter addressed recently, few days ago, to all American bishops. This is why Francis has heavily criticized Donald Trump for the idea of completing the wall between Mexico and US. In his vision, the United States, as the most powerful and most opportunity-rich nation in the world, should welcome more migrants from Latin America and again welcome them with dignity and respect.
Then there is the environmental issue. Bergoglio is the first pope in history to put the global warming at the center of his political agenda. In an encyclical, Pope Francis urged the world's most important countries, such as the United States, to stop poisoning the planet and criticized Washington for withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement. And on this issue too, there was a huge disagreement between Pope Francis and Donald Trump. But Francis is a guy who is very smart. He is very aware of what's happening in the world, and I don't think the issue for him is specifically Donald Trump. I think the Pope is very, very well aware of the fact that Trump is the best expression of the anti-environmentalistic movement that is extremely popular in the US, otherwise Trump wouldn't have won the election 2 times. And that's what Bergoglio is worried about, not the person per se.
And finally, to conclude this first part, I want to put the issue that, in my opinion, is by far the most important. The reason why Pope Francis does not particularly like the United States, in my opinion, has very little to do with his personal dislike for the country and more to do with his awareness of the role of the Church in the world. Let me explain.
The Catholic Church is not only a religious institution, but a great political empire that has existed for nearly 2000 years and that has always confronted and more often clashed with the greatest empires in history. And today, in 2025, the hegemonic empire is precisely the United States. And since the beginning of his pontificate, Jorge Bergoglio, Pope Francis, has tried to completely redesign the relations between Washington and the Holy See compared to his 2 predecessors. John Paul II, Polish Pope, was very close to the US, especially in an anti-Soviet key. It was the end of the Cold War. Subsequently, Benedict XVI became the standard-bearer of religious conservatism. Both popes who preceded Bergoglio were too close to the United States. They flattened the position of the Vatican under those of Washington. So, because of these policies, the Church became a kind of a satellite of the American empire with dire consequences for the Vatican that we will analyze in the second part of the video. Pope Francis is extremely aware and worried of this situation and is trying everything he has in order to change the status quo.
Per inviare un caloroso saluto al nobile popolo cinese.
And precisely in this perspective, that of distancing the Church from the jaws of the American Empire, Bergoglio is by far in history the Pope that has been winking the most at America's rival empires, namely Russia and China. This is evident both by observing the not so intransigent position of the Pope towards Russia, but also by thinking about the great dialogue never existed before that Bergoglio has created between the Vatican and the anti-Western power par excellence, China. And this thing was not taken well by the vast majority of the American public opinion, including Catholic ones.
As I mentioned, the skepticism is mutual. Many Americans, even many Catholic Americans, just don't like this Pope. There are many reasons. Some have to do with the specific character of Jorge Bergoglio. Others are more related to the very peculiar history of Catholics in the United States.
Since its origins, American Catholicism has always been extremely different from both European and South American ones, and the reason is extremely simple. America has been and will always be a country with a Protestant majority, and even if Protestantism were to be in the future surpassed by other denominations, the cultural ethos of the country will always remain Protestant, and this has been and will always be tremendous consequences over the development of Catholicism in the United States. Many moments in American history have contributed to bringing American Catholics closer to Protestant churches and at the same time distancing them from Rome. In the period between the founding of the US and the Great Irish Migration of mid-19th century, Catholics were few and most importantly priests were even fewer, so in order to compensate this absence, local Catholic hierarchies were created, but they ended up being very, very similar to those of Protestant churches.
While priests worried about how to reach far-flung Catholics, lay people devised their own means of staying connected to the church. The social cohesion that developed from this kind of self-sufficient religious practice was real.
With the arrival of millions of Irish and German Bavarian Catholics in the second half of the 19th century, American Protestant elites strongly questioned the possibility that Catholics could be American citizens with full dignity and rights. It was feared that Catholics were more loyal to the Pope in Rome than to Washington. In an attempt to distance themselves from these very serious accusations, which in some cases, such as with the Nativist and the Know Nothing Party, resulted in anti-Catholic violence, American Catholics had to somehow prove their loyalty to the Republic and demonstrate that they were Americans first and Catholics second.
The recent election has developed in an aggravated form every evil against which the American Party protested. Foreign allies have decided the government of the country. Men naturalized in thousands on the eve of the election. Again, in the fierce struggle for supremacy, men have forgotten the ban which the Republic puts on the intrusion of religious influence on the political arena. These influences have brought vast multitudes of foreign-born citizens to the polls, ignorant of American interests, without American feelings, influenced by foreign sympathies, to vote on American affairs, and those votes have, in point of fact, accomplished the present result.
This slow but steady ideological alignment between some American Catholics and the various Protestant churches present in the country has never stopped over the decades, and on the contrary has undergone a serious acceleration due to the big scandal related to abuse committed by American Catholic priests on the faithful.
On the flight from Rome, he said the scandal involving sexual abuse of children by Catholic priests has caused great suffering for the Church in America and for him personally. The Pope says he is deeply ashamed by the scandal and that pedophiles will be banned from ministry.
The scandal of priest abuse in the United States has had two tremendously negative effects on the estrangement between American Catholics and the Holy See. First, people have lost confidence in priests, but most importantly in Pope's appointment of priests, bishops and all the American prelates in general. The vast majority of people have remained Catholic, but in an increasingly isolationist way with respect to Rome, the Pope and all his men in America.
Catholic lay people responded to these revelations with deep sorrow and white-hot anger. Perhaps most striking, however, was the decision that most Catholics made not to abandon the Church in the aftermath of the scandal. They were deeply angry at the hierarchy, but they still wanted the sacraments in their own parish church. More than 80% of them said that being Catholic remained important to them, and almost as many insisted that they could not imagine being anything else.
The second effect of this scandal has been to drain the coffers of the American Catholic Church, which has been devastated by the lawsuits filed by its faithful. In order to survive, many American Catholics and most importantly many American dioceses have thrown themselves into the arms of large private donors who, very important, have an extremely conservative vision of Catholicism, nearly puritanical, and I realize that this is an oxymoron, but you know what I mean. And this vision is the complete opposite of Bergoglio's design for the new church. So of course these two subjects don't get along at all. They are sworn enemies.
Pope Francis has taken strong action against two conservative Catholic leaders, Cardinal Raymond Burke and Bishop Joseph Strickland of Tyler, Texas. Burke, who has been very vocal against the Pope's outreach to LGBTQ+ Catholics, and issued formal questions known as dubia, challenging the Pope's position on various doctrinal issues, has lost his right to a subsidized Vatican apartment and salary.
Why? Because these people, these extremely conservative Catholics, consider Bergoglio too liberal in every possible way. Civil rights, welcoming migrants, global warming, criticism to the American political and economic model, everything. And last but not least, there is something extremely relevant. They absolutely don't want Pope Francis but the Church of Rome in general to impose their men at the top, at the vertex, at the management of important, super important, billions worth American Catholic universities such as, St. John, Georgetown, Notre Dame, these kind of institutions.
And this clash between the Pope and certain parts of American Catholic and non-Catholic society is here to stay a long time, in my opinion. It has already spread way beyond the borders of the US. For example, in Brazil, where American Protestant evangelical churches are stealing millions of faithful to the Catholic Church. And this is something that Bergoglio is extremely concerned about. But let me know in the comments what you think about this whole story. See you in the next one. Ciao, ciao, ragazzi.